Front row people. There are cushions on the front row. What is this about front row?
We always like to hang back.
Yeah, okay. No hanging back tonight. We have to begin by putting our hands together for Andrea Mitchell, who's joined us tonight. Suffice to say, there's some things going on, and it's been busy. It's not easy for this to happen, so we're just so grateful that you figured out how to make this happen on a day like this.
I'm so grateful you've been so patient. Every time I try to come here, something happens somewhere in the world.
Well, I mean, I think that given that you're covering everything, there's bound to be something happening.
This has been a little bit more intense lately, which we can discuss later on.
So here's what's going to happen. You're at the writer's house, and everything is about conversation. So I have thought about some topics I'm really excited to hear Andrea talk about. A lot of them have to do with the earlier periods. Andrea's time at Penn, breaking in here in Philadelphia, which was quite an apprenticeship. Sounds like the perfect apprenticeship for anybody who knows anything about Philadelphia politics at the time of Frank Rizzo and so forth. And then I'll probably have a few questions about the Reagan era, which was, it wasn't just the Anita Hill hearings, but just the whole atmosphere of Washington at the time. You have in your book, which I'll hold up in a second, written a lot about being a woman in TV journalism at that time and sort of waking up to all kinds of things that had been going on for years, and I'd really love to hear about that as well. But there's going to come a point where I will just turn to you for your questions, and we have a portable mic somewhere, and the reason we want you to have a mic, who's got it? Husna, are you the mic person? Thank you, Husna. Nope. Is Mary back there? Hi, Mary. So Mary will come up to you. Wait for the mic because we're recording this session, and also you'll be able to hear better. And it's fine. If Andrea Mitchell can't handle a question from left field, who can?
Right.
Isn't that right?
Or right field, you know.
Or right field. So it's really, right. So it's really okay for you to ask a question. A lot of you are going to want to talk about contemporary politics. It's okay if I'm talking about earlier stuff and you're talking about contemporary. And we're going to do this for about an hour and 5 minutes. Does that sound right? Good. Thank you so much again.
Well, thank you. It feels like I've come home, and it's wonderful to be here. And I've followed everything that you do from somewhat a distance, but
and you've been
proudly.
Regularly, there's emails fairly regularly, love this, love that, and you've been supportive, and we are so grateful for your interest in the idea of a writer's house.
And this is a magical place. And to me, the fact that Kelly Writers exists for students, for the community, and that you have been the magnet for all of this.
Thank you. For a long time, although you are senior and eminent in your field, and it's a little crazy to be talking about a pen project for the duration of this, sitting next to you. I just want to say in front of everybody that, Andrea is a real pen person and has made it possible for the expansion and creation of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, which has been really important to the school. And can we put our hands together, at least our snaps, for that really important venture? But as well, every day, Andrea Mitchell Reports and Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent for NBC, and every possible beat, including the energy beat at one point years and years ago, which you would have thought would have been a dead end, except for in 1979 something happened. Can you tell us what happened in 79 that made suddenly the energy beat really important?
3 Mile Island, right here in Pennsylvania. And it was important because of the gasoline lines and the energy crisis and the crisis that President Jimmy Carter was facing, and then the near meltdown at 3 Mile Island, the fear of radiation release. I was just back this year for the anniversary and talking to people about their fears as they were shutting down the reactor, the still viable reactor, the twin reactors. One, of course, has been shuttered, and contained since the accident. But about 600 people were working there in Middletown, Pennsylvania, still at the ongoing reactor, but nuclear energy right now, because of fracking and a lot of other energy supplies, is simply not sustainable economically. And interestingly, if you talk to people like Bill Gates, who's writing a book right now on climate, a lot of people believe that nuclear is eventually going to be one of the solutions, has to be. But it's very controversial, as you know. Insurance and other problems are really prohibitive economically. And there has not been a single new reactor licensed that was not already on sort of the drawing board, at least, since 3 Mile Island, anywhere in this country.
There's also in that story of you being the energy person at the time of this, aside from the good timing of that, there's a Sid Davis story in there, someone you respect, but your encounter with Sid at this moment was another sexism in TV journalism situation that you had to cope with. Do you mind retelling that story?
I don't, and he will hate it if he hears this, because Sid is...
Hi, Sid.
Sid is out there still calling me and texting when he likes something or when he doesn't like something.
He was kind of a mentor, right?
Great mentor. And we had worked together actually when I was here in Philadelphia at KYW. And he was the Washington guy.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was the Washington radio bureau chief.
Was he a Philly guy?
For Westinghouse, no. But we had a mutual friend, a great guy here, the news director, a man named Fred Walters, who recently passed and was a Harrisburg person. So we had a lot of connections. And then he became the Washington bureau chief for NBC News and hired me.
So your boss.
So he was the boss. 3 Mile Island happens. I had been at NBC for about a year and had been covering energy, the gas crisis. And for the first week, here I am supposed to be covering nuclear energy, and I'm being sent to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission out in Bethesda, Maryland, and all the men are taking turns going to 3 Mile Island. And he was, very appropriately, when we didn't know, not letting any one correspondent or team stay there for more than 24 hours because they did not know how much radiation was released. People were wearing dosimeters. And people were rotating in and out, but I was not on the list. So by Friday night of that week, I go marching in to Sid's office and say, I'm the energy correspondent. I haven't been to 3 Mile Island. Why not? And he said, well, because you're of childbearing age. And, I didn't want to expose you to radiation. And I said to my boss, who really was a father figure in a lot of ways, having known him for all those years, I said, has it occurred to you that men's balls are as vulnerable to radiation as women's ovaries? And I was sent the next day. And I spent about a year there, as a matter of fact. So,
Andrea, there's so many stories like this in that period where you challenged the assumption that women in TV journalism shouldn't do this or that. That's a classic one, but there are others.
Well, just getting that first job here in Philadelphia, it's a big market, Philadelphia, and I was right out of Penn and had failed to get the fellowship that I thought I was going to get.
Yeah, I want to ask you that story a little later.
But in any case, I thought I was going to go and do a B.Lit and in Cambridge, and that didn't work out. So I had been interning at KYW and working at WXPN, which then was student run, not professionally run. And so why not try to get a job in broadcasting? But Westinghouse, then owning KYW, said, it was the NBC affiliate, now that's changed too, said women could not be in the newsroom. So if I was accepted in their management training program, but they said that women could be in advertising or promotion, basically. And I had no interest in either advertising or promotion. So I asked for a job, an entry-level job as a copy boy, which is how I got my first job.
In radio, a copy boy.
A copy boy in radio on the overnight shift. Basically, we had these teletype machines in the copy room, and when news was breaking, a bulletin, they would, it was basically rolls of paper that would keep printing out and the clickety, clickety, clickety. And then if something happened that was important, it would go ding, 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 ding. And then I would go running in and grab the copy and see if it was something to bring to the anchorman and rip it on a ruler, just rip them off, and the things that we didn't need, stick on a nail on the wall, and then run the copy to the anchor man. And basically there, when things happened, there when LBJ on a Sunday night said, "I will not seek nor accept the nomination, to serve another term," and all of a sudden we're there when Dr. King was assassinated, at home when Bobby Kennedy was killed. I mean, those early years in broadcasting, it was the 60s, and there was a lot of unrest in Philadelphia. There was a lot of racial tension, much of it sparked by the police department, a lot of trouble in West Philly. And the police chief, the commissioner, Frank Rizzo, was a very controversial, very divisive man, beloved in some of the communities, but creating more ethnic and racial divisions and exploiting those divisions. And I felt, and many people felt at the time. So I was sent out often in the middle of the night to cover some police incident. There was one notorious one where they arrested a group of Black Panthers and lined them up against the wall and stripped them, supposedly for a search, and then called in the Daily News to take a big front page picture to humiliate these men. And I mean, it was a series of things. I mean, there were far even worse things that happened where people were, one young man was shot in the back while supposedly trying to escape arrest. And we see some of these incidents, many of these incidents still, today. It's obviously not one of the problems that we have solved, but it was particularly hostile in this community because of the leadership, political and police leadership.
I think a few minutes ago I used the word crucible, either here or when we were upstairs. This, being in Philly at that time, having Rizzo as a sort of antagonistic figure for a young reporter, being a woman, being a Penn student, I'm sure he thought, who is this person, right? That was rough, and you took him on. Talking Back is the name of the book, and I think the first episodes of Talking Back is you and Rizzo.
He was very tough, he was very threatening, and he had not been challenged by a lot of reporters, and certainly not by a woman, and did not like it one bit. And in a way, there was kind of an antagonism that today we would say it went viral, but it was on the radio, and he would have these weekly press conferences in room 212, City Hall, or right across from our press room there, in his ceremonial reception area. And I would ask him questions, and he would often come out with rather vulgar or profane comments. It was live on the radio. And there was just a lot of stuff that went down. I do remember, there were those early moments when I had to figure out who was I, and was I going to be involved? You couldn't be involved politically as a reporter. And one in particular was when Nixon invaded Cambodia, the incursion. And my brother was a student at Penn and called, and he and his girlfriend, now his wife still, all these years later, but we really were a Penn family in a lot of ways. And so my brother and his girlfriend called and said, "We're going down to Independence Hall. There's going to be a rally. And can we pick you up?" And I said, "Sure." I wasn't working, and went down, and I saw a lot of people whom I had known as my classmates, but they were now graduate students. They were still on campus, and they were speakers. And the lieutenant, a man named George Fensel, he was the lieutenant in charge of civil disobedience, and he saw me standing in the background. I was not participating. I was just watching. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm just watching." And he said, something to the effect, I can't recall the exact words now, but, are you one of them or not?
Yeah.
And it was actually the right question. No, he's not the right person to have asked it, but it was a question that I needed to ask myself.
Right.
And I realized that, and that was very early on in my journalism career, that at least in those days, there were certain paradigms that you had to observe. And David Brinkley, another mentor of mine and one of the great writers for television news, used to say that there's no such thing as objectivity, because just by selecting what we think is important, that's a very subjective judgment that, anybody writing for the DP or anybody else, anywhere else, understands. You only have a certain amount of space, news hole, whatever, in print. Now we have so many different platforms, but you do have to observe or figure out who you are. Are you going to be an advocate? That there is a place for that, but that's not the role that I wanted to carve out.
Yeah. Before we move forward to the Reagan era, let's go back to Penn. So you loved your time at Penn. You were an English major. Any English majors out there?
There must be.
They're so
yes.
shy. You're supposed to say, yeah, English. And you also had an interest in media and television. And you had this really great idea, what the department now would think was a good idea, but the faculty, being a little more conservative in those days, intellectually conservative in those days, didn't like. Could you tell us about that fellowship application? It certainly shaped your career, didn't it?
It did. I had always thought I was going to be a writer, an English professor, or something in English literature. And I was, because of the radio station, I became very interested in. We were adapting some programs on Chaucer and on some of the other things that I was studying.
On XPN.
On WXPN.
Chaucer on XPN.
Go figure. It was then a classical music station with folk music on Saturday nights and jazz after midnight. And I had a program.
You were one of the voices.
Yeah, I had a program on Tuesday night, I think 8 o'clock, called Musica da Camera. That was rather pretentious, but it was chamber music. And we were,
And you wrote stuff for it when you had time. You actually wrote, your notes.
And it was great fun. I realized how much I loved radio and broadcasting, and so I thought there was a way to combine it, and that was one of my proposals. I guess that was my proposal for my Theron. And I got accepted into Girton College in Cambridge and was hoping to go, and I didn't get it. I remember the particular dean, actually.
Oh, so it was a dean on the committee.
Well, but
an English
from
professor
the
who was a
exactly.
dean. I know who that is, yeah.
And lived in Bucks County on a farm and said something like, "We don't own a television."
Proudly.
And which is okay. I mean, I have a lot of friends who don't own a television and are raising their kids without screens and all sorts of things, but that's a choice. But this was very definitely ideological, and
chastising you. You're not, television. Ugh. Why would you do that?
So I didn't get it. And my parents said that they were willing to send me if I still wanted to do that. But there was something, I don't know, there was something about it. It was so, something about the arrogance, I think.
You encountered academia at a certain moment. No, and you stuck to your television, and thank goodness you did.
Well, and there was a lot of discrimination also in the faculty against women at the time, which I also became aware of later.
In the English department.
In the English
there was
department
a big controversy right at that time. And that person, by the way, who was the subject of that controversy, still teaches. He's retired, but teaches in general honors. Amazing.
That is amazing.
Should we go to the Reagan era?
Yeah, we should move on.
No, but I mean, you're a Penn patriot, big time, and you've supported Penn your entire career. And it wasn't the easiest thing to come here tonight, but you did it because you wanted to hang out with the students and others. And yet, it's okay for us to say Penn was a different place in the 60s.
No, very much so. And, when I first came to Penn, I went to the College of Liberal Arts for Women. So I don't think it was until 1972 that...
A little earlier. 70, I want to say?
Was it 70?
What was your class, 66?
67.
It was 69.
69?
Okay.
Roden and Ed Rendell.
Well,
Judy was the
makes
class of
absolute sense.
66. She's earlier.
They were the two student government leaders who changed that.
Brokered it.
Amazing. And the College of Women was Hill House. The residence was
Right.
Hill House, yeah.
And where was the College for Women, Andrea?
In Bennett Hall.
Bennett Hall. That's
Yeah.
the whole college.
Exactly.
Yeah. The fourth floor was this sort of lounge for ladies, as I recall.
We had different...
I saw pictures.
we had parietals. Women had curfews. And we had a dress code, as I recall. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think we had a dress code.
There was a dress code, yeah. I think it
I don't remember.
slipped away toward the end.
Yeah. And this was the 60s, so this was a rather, socially conservative campus.
But what I want to say is, heroic is if you read this book, by the way, it's called Talking Back, and we have some copies. It's a book that's been out a while, and Andrea probably thinks, why are you hawking this old book? I'm ready to write a new book. But nonetheless, it's a really great story. Any women out there who are interested in careers in journalism?
Great.
So,
More than we need you all.
You really need to read this book because it's hard now. It's still hard. But it was really hard then in ways that, so heroic is the right word, and standing by in academia and saying, Chaucer and television, right? Or going from Penn to KYW and dealing with Rizzo and then going to Washington, that's like a way to start a career. Rough way, but a great way.
Well, it's a great training ground. It
Yeah.
really was.
Yeah.
And think back, this was before Masterpiece Theater, before NPR, really.
It was your idea. If only they had given you
my
the
little bitty
fellowship.
idea. But it turned out okay.
It turned out great.
But the other thing was that I kept thinking that I should have gone to law school or continued to study the violin, but those are the choices we make.
So we go to the Reagan era, and you're still dealing with this same stuff. Larry Speaks at one point, you found out later, basically said, keep Mitchell out. They were real. Don Regan was so furious at you. And Ron, who was always a very kind person, also was bothered by your pesky questions.
But
This was tough.
He was very much the gentleman, and I always felt that for whatever drawbacks Ronald Reagan had, he had his vision. He was hardly engaged in detail. That's certainly well documented, but there was a certain decency about him and loyalty.
And he called on you when all of his people told him, don't call on Andrea
Yes,
Mitchell.
That is correct.
You were sitting way in the back. They would put you in Siberia, and you wore a red jacket.
And I was
To
the
draw
new
attention.
kid on the block. I had not covered him in 1980 in the campaign, so they did not really know me. And it was my first news conference, and my job was basically, as the junior member of the White House team, to shout questions at the president as he walked to and from the helicopter on weekends,
You were the designated shouter.
which is
You're still the designated
which is
shouter.
a chapter. Yes. Well, that's because of secretaries of state who refuse to talk and do all sorts of things that they really are not supposed to be doing, which is a departure from bipartisan secretaries of state. Our diplomats have been superb, as you probably have seen in some of the witnesses at the impeachment hearings, but they are not now, let's just say the leadership has not been backing them up. It's just amply demonstrated. In any case,
He called on you.
he called on me, and fortunately I had a question to ask, but
And a follow-up.
the
That was the Iran-Contra question.
that was the Iran-Contra question. And it was because at that particular moment, that was back in 1987, Iran-Contra, a major challenge to his presidency, really, if he had not handled it, gotten rid of his chief of staff, brought in Howard Baker, the late senator who became chief of staff, and a whole group of people who cleaned house with the National Security Council, where there was a rogue foreign policy. Does that sound familiar? A rogue and foreign policy
In the
going
basement
on
of the White
in the
House.
basement of the White House. So I asked a question, and he called on me, and as I got up, a correspondent from the New York Times jumped up in front of me. And if you want to know whether or not I hold a grudge, I still remember that because I went back and looked at the tape. And he had said, Andrea, and instead this guy jumps up and
Can you
starts
say the
asking
name?
question. No.
Okay.
But Helen Thomas was then the dean of the press corps, and she says, "Thank you, Mr. President." And before he turns, he says, "Wait a second, Andrea, I owe you a question." And I mean, that was Reagan. He knows he had called on me. He knows how important it was. Primetime news conferences. That's when it was the biggest moment. He was for the first time answering questions about all of these allegations of illegality in the National Security Council. And I asked him a question about whether he had, in fact, spent appropriated money in violation of congressional law buying weapons, that went to Iran in order to get hostages out. It was
Against their own policy.
Against their own policy. And he answered the question incorrectly, misspoke. So now it's, 8:35. These news conferences usually lasted about a half hour, from 8 to 8:30. Now it's 8:35. We go back to our little cubicles, and there's a lot of scurrying around, and we were going to be on the air till 9 o'clock. I was not the senior correspondent. My colleague was, but
Chris Wallace.
Chris Wallace, now at Fox, and previously at ABC, but until then he was the chief White House correspondent for NBC. And so they issued a statement, a correction, what the president meant to say. He misspoke, correcting the record. And it was 5 of 9, and I sprinted out to the North Lawn to, got down below the camera level and handed the correction to Chris so that he could...
On your knees.
On my knees.
In the north...
in the mud of the North Lawn to, and he could flawlessly say this just in to Tom Brokaw, who was anchoring before we went off the air at 9 o'clock and went back to whatever the primetime programming was. And I got back to the booth in the back of the White House, the NBC booth, and the phone was ringing, and it was Don Reagan threatening to have me fired.
He was really rude and cruel.
He was
and
really, really profane.
Yelled at you.
Profane. And that was scary.
The chief of staff.
The chief of staff of the White House. But as it turns out, Nancy Reagan had him fired before long for being a really bad chief of staff.
Ha ha.
So,
I'm going to extract the obvious from that, but you asked the question and the follow-up that caused Reagan to misspeak, which was based on bad information his aides had given him. You caused the change in the retraction to take place, and then you literally ran it with your own body out to Chris Wallace. You did everything that night.
Well, part of the challenge and the fun of being a correspondent on breaking news is you want to beat the competition, you want your network to be first, you want your news organization to get it right. And so, it's a team sport, if you will, if I can be a little, casual about something that is a very challenging and now I think more important than ever venture, which is, journalism in Washington, trying to fill the gaps of, what we know and what we don't know about what our government is doing. And those were the days when we were all involved in ascertaining facts, and in general, with the exception of Iran-Contra and a couple of other experiences along the way, White House officials would spin, but they wouldn't lie.
Right.
And they wouldn't lie from the podium. And there was something about the respect for the office and for the relationship with the Fourth Estate. And that has really disappeared in the last 3.5 years. And that is a huge loss. Plus, and this is not anything that President Trump and his people caused, but they've inherited a disaffection for the media and the way all of us are so fractured, and how cannibalized it all is, that people are only seeking their own set of facts. People are going to their corners. I know this is sort of off topic, but the contrast with back then, when we could all at least agree on trying to ascertain what the facts were, and then there were different approaches to any particular story. Yeah. Different judgments were made, but we were not facing daily arguments where the audience is understandably confused and maybe tuning out, and also where people are getting their news often from other places or from particular sets of opinion or advocacy journalism. And I think it has had a profoundly disturbing impact on our politics and on our elections. And that's where democracy becomes challenged.
I think your experience, your career, hints at how Trumpism, for lack of a better word, started in the 80s, when the chief of staff could call you and speak that way to you, which was pretty unprecedented, surely. And the Anita Hill hearings could have taken place. That was completely unprecedented in the the ideological divide and the way she was treated. And all of that comes back to us in the last few years. What I wanted to do is turn to Anita Hill and ask you to read a couple paragraphs from the book. It's really about something that most people don't know. Andrea, it's maybe this to there. And it's about how people, and particularly Congress women, from the House of Representatives, came over to the Senate to make sure that Anita Hill got her hearings. I didn't know this or hadn't remembered it. It's really an important moment.
It was a moment. And I just want to say parenthetically that my friend and colleague Ruth Marcus from the Washington Post, who is a Penn mother and a Harvard Law graduate, has written a book now called Supreme Ambition, with some extraordinary new reporting on the background of the Kavanaugh hearings.
Right.
And she and I we met during campaigns and White House coverage, but we really bonded during the Anita Hill hearings. And I interviewed Anita Hill recently because of the controversies with Joe Biden and the way he ran that hearing.
Right.
But
this is totally relevant to that.
But just last night, we were celebrating Ruth and at a Washington Post gathering of writers. She's the deputy editorial page writer for the Washington Post. And we were celebrating her and her book, and we were talking about this very thing. So
interesting.
But Hill's charges resonated with women in Congress, which had always been a bastion of male prerogatives. On the day a final vote was scheduled, a handful of completely outnumbered congressional women, led by Representatives Pat Schroeder and Barbara Boxer, marched on the Senate, challenging the upper chamber to hold a more extensive debate on Clarence Thomas's nomination instead of rubber stamping it. With my camera crews in full chase, the women tried to storm the weekly lunchtime caucus of the Senate Democrats as they discussed whether to reopen hearings so Hill could air her charges. The Democratic senators, outraged at the presence of House members in their midst, blocked their entrance. The Senate's only female Democrat at the time, Barbara Mikulski, was clearly outnumbered. Now there are 14 women in the Senate. Well, now that's outnumbered, but I mean, that's out of date. Now there are 14 women in the Senate, including notably Hillary Rodham Clinton. I wonder if she could have turned that small rebellion into something bigger. Separately, the women House members, despite having no constitutional role in the process, since only the Senate confirms, as you all know, tied up unrelated legislation in the lower chamber as a further protest. It was mayhem on both sides of the Capitol. The issue of sexual harassment had struck a nerve in the body politic. Finally, late in the day, the White House caved. Bowing to the inevitable, Thomas's supporters agreed to postpone a final vote until the charges could be heard and answered. I knew and trusted people on both sides of the issue, including Thomas's principal sponsors, Ken Duberstein, who was then at the White House, and Senator John Danforth from Missouri, a Republican. Both swore that Thomas was incapable of behaving as Anita Hill described. Opposing them, a phalanx of Washington lawyers and Harvard scholars, long active in civil rights law, vouched for Anita Hill. Both Thomas and Hill had grown up poor, earned law degrees at Yale, and gone to Washington to make their way. Now their seemingly exemplary lives were going to be picked apart in what we all knew would be a brutal hearing.
That was also a first. Women in the House asking the senior chamber and forcefully to do something about this. And that predicts, of course, what's happened later.
It's so interesting that you seized on this. I had forgotten not about that event, because during the Kavanaugh hearings, I dug up the footage of that march and used it in one of the stories showing.
And they blocked them physically from coming in.
And the fact that these House members, females no less, and there weren't that many of them, and now we've seen what's happened in the House. If you look at the Judiciary Committee or the Intelligence Committee, I've gotten to know some of the freshman Democratic women, and they're mostly Democrats because of the way the House turned. And a lot of them have CIA, Pentagon, or other military experience. A number of them are veterans. And Val Deming is a former police chief, one of the really...
Mikey Sherrill, I think, from New Jersey.
Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey, and Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, and Eliza Frankel from Michigan, from the Pentagon and CIA. So there's just a lot of strength and and power among these women, power in numbers too. So it would not have been a march to take on the Senate Democratic lunch. It would have been probably a meeting.
Right, good. Progress.
I'm not sure how far they would have gotten because confirmation procedures are so, obviously constitutionally in the Senate.
Yeah. So, Mary, are you there with the poor mic? We have an opportunity for people to ask questions. And again, it doesn't have to be in sequence about these earlier things. So we have a question right here from Bob. Hello, Bob.
Since we're in the writer's house, I wanted to ask a question about the writing process on the TV news shows.
Mm-hmm.
I notice in the credits there are people credited as writers. Is that a sort of, what do they do? Is that a different career path from reporters and so forth? Or how does that work?
The writers, I write my own program and write my own stories. And then they're edited by producers, and we fight out, word by word. I mean, there are fact issues always, and those are determined, collaboratively. Then there are stylistic issues, and that's always a challenge. And then there's the terror of the clock when stories, because of the compression, especially on a network newscast, are very, very, short and with a lot of breaking news. Other things get crowded out. So the writing is challenging, particularly because of compression, and often with compression, things can be taken out of context too easily. So you really have to be very expert. Editing short is a lot harder. Well, that. We all know that.
Possible.
But there are programs where the anchors don't do their own writing. Not the network newscasts. The network anchors write their own copy. But there could be a transition or a story that is, the lead-ins, for instance, to a particular story would probably be written by a writer on the staff. Generally, the network anchors write with a writer maybe helping out the headlines and the opening of the show, and then some of the lead-ins and certainly their own stories when they go in the field. But there would be a writer who would write an introduction, let's say, to my story that night and check with me on what the particular facts are. And I would say, well, show me the copy, and I would approve it, that kind of thing. And other senior producers would approve it as well for style, compression, or length. And then in documentaries, then the writers are working with correspondents. And I don't know the process in long form as well as in daily broadcasts.
But on news shows, they seem pretty anonymous, the writers. Is that a career path? I mean, do they stay? What happens to those people?
It can very, very much be a career path, because if you don't want to be in front of the camera or out in the field producing, you can be a writer working on the rim of a nightly newscast for decades, and sometimes traveling with the anchor and producers if you're going to a major event. But just the craft of writing, yes, it is a career, because there's a lot that goes into a network newscast, and often I'm trying to think of another example, but we sit around every afternoon at 2:30 when I'm in New York or on the phone from Washington, and if I've got a story in the show, and we exchange ideas of how we should lead into a story, and I'll present a story, let's say at 2:30 for that evening's newscast, and I'll read through my draft script, and then the producers will comment on it and say, why don't you move this around, and why don't you do this? And so it's a work in progress. And then at night, if I'm working on a Today Show story, if I'm out doing an interview, I'll say to a producer, why don't you put together an outline for me? Grabbing the pieces of the interview that you suggest I would want to use. Let's say the pieces of the video, and transcribe it first, and then pull some sound and let me take a look at it, especially if you're on deadline, and then you come back in. And if you're on the campaign and they're looking at interviews that are done by other people for you, if you're in Iowa and someone is also interviewing someone in New Hampshire for you. And then they put it all together and give you a shot list of what the pictures look like, who's been interviewed, and then you sit down to write your piece.
Thank you for the question, Bob. I think Jamie Lee Jocelyn in the back there has a question. Hello, Jamie Lee. By the way, you and Andrea have something in common.
We do?
Yep.
We both went to Penn.
Oh, you have another thing in common.
We both like New Hampshire.
That's for sure.
She's from New Hampshire. She spent a lot of time in New Hampshire. How about marathon?
My family lives up there.
Oh, I did. Are you a
She ran a marathon in
I was.
1996.
Oh my
but
goodness,
I
I
haven't
didn't
been
know.
able to do that since. But I ran the New York Marathon.
So did I.
She also ran out to the North Lawn and gave Chris Wallace a note.
It was such an emotional experience. I don't know what your experience was, but the marathon, running through New York City, I was raised in New York and the suburbs of New York, but when you run through the neighborhoods and you hear the music and the people coming out, it was really thrilling.
Well, because I'm from New England, I actually don't like New York City very much. But I felt very emotional when I was running through the streets of New York City. So that was not my question, though. What I wanted to ask was, first I wanted to say it was so exciting for me and for, I think, other people in this room to see you sitting next to Ashley Parker.
Wasn't she
Yes.
great?
She's one
Yes.
of ours.
You know, and what was very cool is at one point when Ashley was on with Brian Williams leading up to the debate when we had been announced, Brian, who often, says that he's not a college graduate, and he'd gone to Catholic University, dropped out to work in the Carter White House. And so he made some reference to the fact that there was going to be enough Ivy League brain power on the panel. There was going to be, 2 from Penn, 1 from Harvard, Kristen Welker, a Philadelphian, and Rachel Maddow from Stanford. So,
It's
Not
pretty
bad.
good.
I was in very good
Yeah.
company, but Ashley's terrific.
Right. So I guess I wanted to ask you generally about working with Ashley and what that was like, and then also just about how you've approached mentorship over the years. I know Ashley, as you were just talking about before this, Ashley hasn't done a ton of TV, even though she's done a ton of writing. So I'm wondering how you've approached mentorship, especially with young women, maybe first being on TV over the years.
Well, it's one of the thrills of being, kind of a senior citizen here in television, in that I have been able to watch these extraordinary young women just thrive, grow, and challenge themselves, and embrace new opportunities, as Ashley has. She's just terrific. I first met her when she was working for Maureen Dowd at the New York Times, and she and others have shown. So, it's very scary. I was a nervous wreck at that debate because every second counts, and it's 2 hours, and we had prepared more than 60 questions. We knew we wouldn't get to all of them, but we had to make a lot of, our producers in the truck, in the control room, had to make a lot of game day decisions. You want to be relatively even in time. It's not going to ever work out exactly, but you don't know how people are going to interact with each other, the candidates. And then they also wanted to be fair about how much time we got. So we had worked together on crafting questions, but ended up not always asking the questions we planned to ask, because in our ears, Rashida Jones, who is now our executive producer in charge of all of this, Rashida would be saying, Ashley, you pick up number 17 from Andrea. Andrea, drop 19, go on to 21. Rachel, you pick it up with 25. And she's sort of sorting through. She's got a stopwatch. She's figuring out with producers with her how much time each candidate has gotten, when the next commercial break is coming. And all of that is stressful. But Ashley was just terrific. And one of the joys has been that I have worked with a lot of women, and fortunately, Michelle Perry, my executive producer of my program, has been with me 15 years. She started as a desk assistant and researcher and moved up over the years. And one of my other great researchers, Libby Least, is now the executive producer in charge of the entire Today Show, all 4 hours of it. Mm-hmm. And then the first executive producer of my daytime MSNBC show, Jen Suazo, is now the executive producer of NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. So the two premier NBC broadcast newscasts are led by women with whom I've worked. And just today in New York, I was with our segment producers, one of whom has just been promoted to produce the 10 o'clock hour with Hallie Jackson. And we've also been navigating a lot of pregnancies and maternity leaves. We've had 4 babies in the last 5 years, with each, family taking 6 months maternity leave. And so a lot of adjustments. And so we are an expanding, growing group, and a lot of, anyway, it's been very joyful. And I have enough clout now that I can, spot people and help them with their careers, and that's been great.
But not only clout, Mary, we're going to go over here. Not only clout, but having all these relationships with people who are now in charge should make your job just a little easier.
I think sometimes it's like when your father or mother is the Cub Scout leader or the Brownie and Girl Scout leader, they lean over backwards not to advantage you.
Oh, okay.
I don't know,
guess
but
it's harder than
no,
okay.
it's great in that we know each other and trust each other. And
Yeah.
And if I call and say, this is really important, this is something you've got to think about.
Right.
It may not be on your radar.
Right.
Obviously, I can get a hearing.
Right. So we're a long way from KYW, or, you can actually help shape the news. Yeah.
And hopefully, there are some tendencies that in all of our broadcasts, in the broadcast media, that require, can be improved. I mean, the way we cover campaigns. I've been on the record saying that we should not have been carrying all of those Trump rallies live without editorial judgments about whether they were worth it or not, because it was all free media. And to a lot of people, it was very entertaining, and it was, a lot.
Yeah.
So I just think we have to do a whole lot better in this campaign cycle than we did. And one of the challenges is to find the time with the press of breaking events. It just seems, Al and I were talking when I first arrived, that every day there's something else that replaces something that's really important. And, Pensacola, the horror of that, the gun issue, and then we move on to something else. Climate, what could be more important than doing serious work on that?
And this
That's
White
an
House
existential
is
threat.
very good at getting you off the topic you want to
Right.
be on, and that's obviously a strategy.
But I have enough, like today, when we started our newscast, we were dealing with the articles of impeachment, which at 9 o'clock this morning were announced. 2 articles, they're, trying to contain this and figure out what their strategy is. And we had a lot to say. We had not been on the air yesterday. I was on the air on NBC's coverage of the hearings, the Judiciary Committee hearings, for 9 hours, but I didn't have a show because all regularly scheduled programs were preempted by the hearings on both cable and broadcast. So that's been the way we've been going since this has all started. So I was very eager to dig down into Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General's report. Then we learned that Pete Williams is going to sit down in 11 o'clock with the Attorney General for his first interview, and we're going to be able to carry that as soon as they finish it. So that turned out to be a 25-minute interview, so I had to kill all the other things that we had planned to do for that half of the show. But one of the little things that I can do, and I know this sounds minor, but they had sketched out an open for me when I got off the train this morning coming from D.C. to New York, which would include, and you ask what writers do, they had done an outline for the first segment of our show about the articles of impeachment. And we knew what we wanted to say. And then they suggested adding a phrase, and the president is sure to fire back at a rally in Hershey, Pennsylvania tonight. And I said, I don't think we have to mention that. We're covering the articles of impeachment. When he fires back, if he does something that's important, we'll cover it later tonight or tomorrow. We don't have to give him the added,
right.
push before he even does it. Nor do we have to carry every tweet. Now, I've argued with people who say, why do you care about his tweets? Well, I care about his tweets when he fires the Secretary of State at 8:40 in the morning. And that's something. Or when he decides that on a Sunday or a Saturday night that he's going to pull out of northern Syria and abandon the Syrian Kurds, and tweets that decision after being on the phone with the Turkish leader Erdogan without having consulted the Pentagon, and most, they sort of knew this was coming because of all of the tells, but he did not notify our allies. So the Brits and the French, who had troops on the ground, very quietly, special forces, who rely on our air cover and our supply lines, were completely, shocked by this. What does that mean for the next NATO meeting, which we just saw? Well, you saw what happened at the next NATO meeting in London. There's a lot of wreckage about that decision.
Yeah.
So anyway, tweets can be important. We don't have to cover all of them, and we don't have to cover his insults.
If everybody asserts that control over that line that doesn't need to be said, not just you, then things change.
That's the little. I have an hour that I can control,
Right.
pretty much, when it's not preempted, a day,
Which it has been. But
which it has been a lot of, and then obviously the other broadcasting that I do, so I can control and I can speak up internally about what I think is important.
yeah. We had a question. Oh, Sky's got the mic.
Yeah.
Hello,
Hi.
Sky.
Hi, Al. So I now, too, am studying English at Penn. And undergrad at Penn, especially at the Kelly Writers House, has been a very rewarding experience because I feel like I'm learning how to think critically for myself about the world. I'm learning how to think. And I recently took Jamie Lee's creative writing course, Sports Narrative, and I was able to experiment with journalism for the first time. And I found that with journalism, it comes down to the questions that you ask. And I'm curious your process with learning how to ask those questions.
That's a really good question, because I often think that some of my mentors who went to law school are better than I am at asking questions, and certain people who have Jesuit training are better at asking questions. But what I try to do is listen to the answers. And I don't go in with a preset notion, I'm going, a list of questions that I'm going to ask. Because when you do that, you don't hear when someone says something that may be new and interesting and provocative, or correct or incorrect, which you want to challenge or follow up. So there's an organic process involved. I think there are times when questions can be too long and you're not getting the best response. It's usually a good idea to ask questions, especially if it's an adversarial interview where you don't know how the person is going to respond, but you know the factual answer so that you can then challenge it. One of the things that has been really annoying me about this Ukraine controversy is when people say, well, why does it matter? They got the 391 million. Well, it matters because they didn't get it for 55 days. It's a hot war. People died. And it projected to the world, certainly to Vladimir Putin, that this new, young, completely untested leader could not stand up to the former KGB guy in Moscow. And he went into negotiations in Paris over a ceasefire with Putin, face-to-face for the first time. He still has not gotten his White House meeting that was supposed to strengthen him so that he could project that he had the backing of the United States. To the contrary, by not having those weapons and by the way they were withheld against U.S. law, by the way, it weakened him domestically. Now he looks like a pushover, and so there are protests against him by those who think he's been rolled by Trump and others who think he might be caving in too much to Putin. So we don't know what's going to happen with this new government in Ukraine, all because of the precipitous holding of the weapons. So you need to know that context so that when a senator says to you, well, they got the weapons anyway, you know that was materially damaging to the Ukrainians. And therefore you don't write your story saying, well, the Republicans say they got their weapons anyway, so it doesn't matter. You always have to put in the context. The Republicans are saying that, but, and then explain the context. And that's what has evolved with the way I think reporting
So
has to be.
not only do you have to be good at asking questions, but you have to do your work and your research.
The homework is really important.
In prior to asking a great question isn't going to be good if somebody makes a rejoinder and you can't.
Now, I don't know this for a fact. I worked with Roger Mudd, but I'm pretty sure that in 1980, when Roger Mudd asked Ted Kennedy, why did he want to be president, that Roger Mudd, an experienced, political correspondent working at CBS, had in the back of his mind that Ted Kennedy was too young, too inexperienced, and too much riding on his family name to really be seriously challenging the President of the United States, or that many people thought that, at least. And he was probing to see, had Ted Kennedy really thought through why he wanted to be president, other than that it would be part of the family legacy. That's harsh in the way I'm sort of caricaturing it, but those are some broad strokes about that relationship, that dynamic, and it was devastating, and Kennedy couldn't answer the question. Ted Kennedy ended up being one of the greatest senators of all time, in my view, and an extraordinary legislator. But at that point, he was not prepared to explain why he wanted to be president. And that's still a question that I think could be appropriately asked of some of the people running. And what is your vision?
Andrea, I want to do something fun-ish toward the end here. I hope you're game for it. It's a lightning round.
Okay.
I'm going to name a person, and I'm hoping you will give us a one-line response to that person, or a tagline. All right. Mikhail Gorbachev. Got a one-liner?
Revolutionary.
I like that. That was one word. Catherine Graham.
She's such a complicated person.
Yeah. You can do a sentence on her.
She rose to such great leadership with almost no one to help her.
Right.
And she wrote one of the greatest memoirs I've ever read.
There's a recommendation. All right, Betty Ford. And you knew both of them pretty well.
Rebellious. Think of that picture of her dancing on the cabinet table. Look it up. Just a quick anecdote. When she got breast cancer, people didn't even use the word breast on television. In politics, something called the Hay Act that, in fact, censored movies for years and years. And she invited the press corps to Bethesda Naval Hospital for a photo opportunity where Jerry Ford, the President of the United States, was embracing his wife and talking about her breast cancer. She had just had a mastectomy. And she was in a nightgown and bathrobe, the First Lady of the United States.
Amazing.
And she wanted to tell people, get screened. And then she set up the Betty Ford breast cancer centers so people could get mammograms around the country. So she was very much a rebel, and also, had, I know this is not quick, but she had her, her addictions and all of those other problems, and she overcame them. So, survivor.
Elian Gonzalez.
Pawn.
Yeah, that is a sad story. And you were so in the middle of that whole story.
I saw him years later. I saw him when he was 6 years old, back in kindergarten, and had successfully gotten reunited with his father.
Right.
But he was just caught up in the hot, vicious battle between factions here over Cuba.
Chris Matthews. Philadelphia guy.
Philadelphia guy, neighborhood guy, and a great friend.
Yeah. A couple more. Jessica Savage.
Tragic.
And you knew her.
Yeah.
She was in Philly when you... Yeah.
She was in Philly, and I knew her in Washington. We actually shared an office. We were roommates.
Oh, I didn't know that. Cokie Roberts.
The best of the best. She was just great correspondent, great mentor, great friend.
I wonder if we could end with you reading a paragraph from the very end of the book, and while you're looking at it, I'll preface it by saying, Andrea, that the sub-theme of this book,
I'm going to get my reading glasses, too.
yeah, the sub-theme of this book is how hard you work and how you never, because you really wanted to get this right, you're a perfectionist, temperamentally, but you also knew that as a woman in this field, you had to say yes, and you took on so much, and you still take on so much, and this is a paragraph kind of about that.
Along this journey, I have made sacrifices I sometimes regret, although none so important that I would take the path not chosen. As I was warned so many years ago, this is indeed a course for a long-distance runner. If asked what qualities helped me earn whatever success I have had in this venture, I'd have to list endurance near the top. It is what drove me to the finish line of the New York City Marathon in 1996, 2 days before the election, and still carries me through assignments in remote regions far from family and friends. But perhaps even more important is an insatiable curiosity about the way other people live their lives, their hopes, disappointments, privations, and triumphs. Those are the stories that inspired me to want to be Brenda Starr, girl reporter, imagining an adventurous life then available only to women in comic strips.
Andrea Mitchell.
Thank you.
Andrea Mitchell, everybody.
Thank you all.
Andrea, thank you so much for coming. We have hardcover and softcover copies of the book, and I'm sure Andrea would be willing to stay here or stand around here. Sure. If you want to buy a copy and have her inscribe it and say hello to her, we have a few minutes. So thank you again, Andrea. Thank you all for coming today. This was really great.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
You okay?